So just a quick correction, I actually recently left Hubspot to start something new, so recent that we didn't have time to update it, but be announcing in a couple weeks. But today I'm actually here not to talk about that. I'm here to talk about a subject that I think is probably the most under-talked about subject in all of optimization and growth, and that's retention. And the reason that I think retention is so important is basically when people are pursuing really high volume growth, they ask me kind of what separates the top 1% from the bottom 99%. And the clear answer is retention. Of course, yeah, right? Still waking up. But this is a graph. We're going to dive into these retention curves a little bit in a second, but this is a graph from Andrew Chen's blog that shows you basically the top line is the top 10 apps in the Android store, and what the retention curve is compared to the next 99%. And you can see it stands out far and above the rest. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to go through those reasons. And so the big point that I want to get across is that if you have poor retention, nothing else matters, right? And so usually when I talk to companies and advise companies, they want to know about how to acquire more users, how to optimize their landing pages. But the first thing that I dig into is retention, because if they don't have that, then any work at the top of the funnel isn't really going to matter over the long term. And we can see that in this graph here. And so what you see here is on the y-axis, basically weekly active users. This is all fake data. On the x-axis, you see time. What every single one of these layers are basically a new cohort of acquired users, right? And so what you see is basically, this is an example of bad retention, is that with every new cohort that we add on here, growth eventually flattens off because our retention, we're not basically retaining users over time. The big point here is that if we were to look at just this first part of this curve, right, we would think that we were probably doing a good job. We were growing, right? But if we played it out over time, based on the metrics that we were seeing in the early part of this curve, we would understand that, hey, like we're actually going to be in big trouble later on. And so that's this big thing about retention, is that it's called the silent killer because it's very hard to notice the effect that bad retention is having on in the short term, and you kind of have to look at it over the long term. To counter that, let's look at what decent retention looks like. In this graph, basically every cohort of users eventually flattens off. We retain a certain percentage of them. And so even though I'm acquiring basically the same amount of users in every single cohort, I'm doing nothing more at the top of the funnel, I still grow my weekly active users over time. Obviously, if we were to layer on increasing size of cohorts over time, we would see an even bigger acceleration over time. Looking at retention on a revenue basis, this is what incredible retention looks like. Some of the best SaaS companies out there have this retention. And so in subscription businesses, we can look at cohorts that might actually expand, called net negative churn, right? This means that basically companies like Salesforce and New Relic, even HubSpot now, basically has basically net negative retention and expanding revenue cohorts that basically give them this nice looking exponential curve over time. All right, so there's more. There's more reasons why retention is the most important thing. And that's because it affects all of these other things that we have in our funnel. The first thing is that if I increase retention, I'm most likely to increase my LTV. Right? Whether that's an ad-based business or a subscription-based business. If it's an ad-based business and I'm retaining more users over a longer period of time, I can get more ads in front of them, and therefore I'm monetizing everybody on a longer basis. Now, what happens when we increase an LTV of a user? We can tend to afford higher costs of acquisition at the top of the funnel, and that becomes a competitive advantage. I can outbid customers in paid acquisition and spend more money on marketing. Another thing that increasing retention does was if you have any kind of sense of virality in your product, it would increase virality, right? So the longer that I retain users, the more virality touch points I can get in them over time. Consider Dropbox as an example. The longer that they retain users, the more opportunities that user is likely to basically share a folder and bring a new user into their product, right? And as I increase virality, I can decrease my effective cost of acquisition, which once again gives me a competitive advantage. The third point, increase retention, I can increase my upgrade rates in things like freemium products, right? The longer that I retain a user, the more opportunities that I get to upgrade that person, and as I do that, I can decrease my payback period. The point is that every improvement that you make to retention actually also has this effect across all of the other pieces of your funnel, whether that's around virality or cost of customer acquisition, LTV, payback period, right? And so retention is really sort of the centerpiece, the foundation, and that's why it's so important. So that begs the question, how do we improve retention? Well, the first thing that we need to do is it all starts with cohorts. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with these graphs. I hate looking at cohorts in this sense because it's really hard to make sense of this. And so what I typically do is translate them into basically a retention cohort curve. What this basically does is it plots out the percentage that are still active over time. And what you see here is I have two different retention curves. And there's a big difference between them, and it really highlights the most important thing that we look for in retention, whether that's revenue retention or user retention. And that is that it flattens off, or gets pretty close to flat, right? A really bad retention curve basically trends towards 0. That's that first graph that I showed you in the presentation. That means that eventually, over time, I'm gonna lose 100% of users that I acquire in a given cohort. That means I need to keep churning and burning that acquisition funnel just to grow. It makes it really, really hard to grow. And so the big thing is that if you have a retention curve that trends towards 0, you actually have to ask a different question before you go into the optimization process, because it might actually be a product market fit problem and not an optimization problem, right? And so these retention curves, these flattened retention curves, are actually the best quantitative indicator of whether we have product market fit or not. And of course, if we don't have product market fit, no amount of optimization is actually going to help the problem. Okay, but let's assume that it's not a product market fit problem. Okay, what do we do next to basically optimize and improve retention? I'm gonna walk through a couple examples here. A product that I worked on at Hubspot was called Sidekick. The product was basically an email plugin. It gave you a few extra features, whether you're on Gmail, Outlook, or Apple Mail, let you track and see who opened and clicked on your emails. It brought all sorts of profile information in your emails, did a couple other things. And so a couple years ago, basically, we had gone through a rapid period of growth. We were acquiring a bunch of users. We did a deep dive into retention. We noticed two really concerning problems. One was that our retention curves were shifting down over time, and they weren't flat. It wasn't as bad as it looks here, but they were trending towards 0 over the course of about a year and a half. And of course, that worried me taking a long-term perspective. And so what did we do? I'm gonna walk through a few different steps. The first step that we did is really simple. We just segmented the curve in a bunch of different ways. And I would recommend just segmenting the curve in many which ways that you possibly can. Tools like Mixpanel and Amplitude make this really easy now, so there really aren't any excuses to not do this, but you can segment it by user source, the landing page that they came through, the technology that they're using, by persona, by the actions that they might have taken in their first use, all of these different ways, because these all tell a different story if the retention curves look very different. Right? So I might, as an example, I might have a retention curve that's trending towards 0, but once I segment it based on user source, I actually find that, well, there's this certain user source, maybe my paid marketing, that is the segment of users that's trending towards 0, bringing down my average, but the other sources are totally fine, right? And so that actually tells me it's actually an acquisition problem, not a retention problem. But basically, one of the ways that we segmented this on Sidekick was that we took people that signed up with a corporate email versus a free mail, Gmail, Yahoo, a Hotmail, all that kind of stuff, and segmented them, right? And we noticed a really, really big difference. Not only were the corporate emails higher in the early part of the retention curve, but they were also slower to churn over a long period of time, right? The point is that these segmentations start to give you hints towards the attributes of your users. One hint that we took from this was obviously people in a company context that were signing up for this were much better quality users than people signing up for this in a free mail context. And I'll show you in a little bit about what we did about that. And so once we segmented all these curves and we were looking for all of these different attributes, the second part we needed to ask was, okay, well, what part of retention do we really want to optimize? And this is a really important question because sitting there and saying, well, I want to optimize retention is a really vague and big question, and you need to kind of break it down into more actionable pieces. Because retention really has 4 main components. The first component is basically this new user experience. That might be day one, week one, month one, depending on the natural usage behavior of your product. But the big point in this new user experience is that you need to get users to experience the core value as quickly as possible. I'm sure all of you have heard about the aha moment that has become very popular. But that is the big point in week one retention. This is very different than the middle part of the curve. In midterm retention. Once we get them to experience the core value, the second thing that we need to do is that we need to create habits around that core value. We need to rewire their brains, right? And so Nir talked a lot about this in one of the opening presentations I think it was on Wednesday. But a lot of people miss this. A lot of people think, well, if I just get them to understand the product up front, I've done my job, right? But the hardest thing to change is basically is human behavior, right? So once you get them to understand it, you need to rewire their brain around that core value and have them establish that habit. The third part of retention is basically long-term retention. And the point here is that we need to get users to experience this core value as often as possible over a long period of time. Because once we build that habit, right, we need to get them to continue to invest in that habit over time. And then the fourth and often overlooked piece of retention is basically resurrection or dormant users. Basically, that's all the people that you've lost up into a certain point. And how do you sort of re-engage them, right? And so for Sidekick, basically what we noticed was our two biggest problem points were basically that new user experience as well as that long-term retention. And so the third step we did is we dug into those individually. We dug into basically the first week retention first. And basically, for any part that we look at, whether it's first week, midterm, or long term, there's three basic steps. We segment even more to basically understand what's going on in that part of the curve. We look for quantitative indicators between basically the healthy set of users versus the non-healthy set of users. And then we also research kind of the why behind it, one-to-one qualitative data. And so as we kind of dug into this, one of the basically quantitative indicators that we looked at is we basically looked at how many emails were sent with the product on the first day, and we compared the healthy set of users, the users that retained over a long period of time, versus the non-healthy users, the people who dropped off very early, and looked at differences. And one of the differences that we found was that the non-healthy bucket of users were only sending one email in that first day. That was really confusing to us because the product was so simple to use once you got it installed. You actually didn't have to do anything once you had it installed. You just had to continue to sending users. So users were actually taking a really big step in order to not send any more emails with our product installed. And so we needed to basically look into that and figure that out. And so what we did then was we basically took that segment of users who only sent that one email. We all sent them emails that looked like a personal email from me or one of our team members, and we asked them a simple question. We asked them why. Why did you only send one email with Sidekick installed? And we got all of these responses back. We got hundreds of responses back. We categorized them into these different buckets. But the biggest bucket that we found was that they said, well, I didn't really have time to figure it out. And once again, that didn't really make sense to us because they already had it installed. There was nothing really left to figure out. All they had to do was continue sending emails. Well, we basically ran about 14, 15 different experiments, basically cleaning up that first landing experience once they installed the product. All of them failed. It took us a month to basically do that. All of them failed. We didn't know what was going on. We kind of went back to the drawing board, re-explored our data, and what we found was basically that users were confused because they were installing an email product, and then our first experience was a web application that we landed them on. We ran about 8 more experiments, basically disconnecting them, not showing them a web application, just sending to their email, and we had pretty impressive results. Basically, the 5 strategies that worked for us at the end of this new user experience was that, one, is that we separated that new user experience based on persona. So what we found was that we had salespeople coming in, we had marketers coming in, and we had a couple other major personas, and they were all expecting something totally different. Sorry, I skipped to number 2 here. And so we redid the messaging depending on every persona that they came in. We redid basically the core value prop around them, and we saw improvements there. The third thing that we did was, based on the segmentation of those curves that I showed you up front, was that we ended up switching the user context from personal to work. We saw that users that entered with the work context retained much better. And so all we did was, if they signed up with a free mail address, we gave them a simple message saying, hey, this product, you'll get more value out of this product if you use it for work. Why don't you sign up with your work email? And we ended up making some big improvements there. We also tested the medium of education, basically videos versus just plain text versus images versus like sort of GIF images. What we found was that basically videos worked best for us, but we found that it didn't necessarily work best for some of the other products that we were working on. And fifth and not least is that on accident we found that we were sending content from our blog to people within that first couple days, and people who were receiving that content actually did better than people who weren't. And so we kind of formalized that into a program. The end result is that we were able to basically shift these curves. Up pretty substantially, about 10 to 15 percentage points, which actually equated into hundreds of thousands of users over the next year. The big reason I wanted to point this out is that there's a really critical thing about new user and optimizing for new user experience, and that is that users are forming an opinion. And that's a really interesting thing, because what we notice is that once people form opinions, they're really hard to change, right? They dig in, they don't really change their opinions often. And so any kind of improvement that we make to that new user experience, that day or week one experience, we always tend to get this pattern. We shift the entire curve up, right? And this is really important because that's very impactful. That's very impactful over time, right? And so that's why you see some of the probably most developed growth teams actually spend the majority of their time in onboarding a new user experience. The second big thing about new user experience, and this is a really big challenge, is that you're looking to balance two things, basically permissions and friction. And what I mean by permissions is basically getting permissions through different channels to contact them. That might be push notifications, that might be email. And friction is about that friction to getting them to that initial core value. These two things tend to be in opposition of each other, right? The more permissions I ask for, the more friction I'm adding to the process. But this is really important that you need to balance this. You can't have a completely frictionless process and not get permissions, because remember, the second part of the retention curve is building that habit. And to build that habit, that channel is really, really important. So we'll see that here in basically the midterm and the long-term retention, they tend to be fed and optimized by the same exact thing. And that's basically what I call retention loops, right? Nir, once again, might call them habit loops. But they're formed by three essential things, right? Your trigger, right? And triggers can be based off a lot of different things. That might be time, location, it might be peer-initiated as your friends signed up. Those triggers basically trigger some kind of action that are pushed through a channel. That might be email, social, push, in-app, right? And eventually they get a reward. That might be a message, photo, you might be satisfying their curiosity. But we really need to think about basically those permissions up front, because once again, that second step, that channel, is really, really important. And so one very easy example, if you want to see these retention loops in action, there's one company, one product that does this unbelievably well, and that's LinkedIn, right? And so one example of basically their midterm retention, right, is that they're trying to build a habit around filling out your profile, right? The reason they're trying to build that habit is because not only is it the center of their core experience, it's also the center of their growth strategy, right? The more you fill out your profile, the higher you're going to appear in the SEO results as people search your name, the more people land it, the more people they acquire, right? Point is, though, in that midterm retention, once they get you signed up, once they get you that core value, they're really trying to build that habit around making you think about this profile is really substantial. And so one trigger that's really common if you go to the product is they'll send you an email. They'll say you got X number of profile views in the last month, right? They're appealing to that ego part of our personality. And of course, what they're asking you to do is why don't you fill out your profile even more to receive more views, right? They push that through email, and then of course the reward is if you take that email and actually fill out that profile, you'll get more profile views, and then the next month they'll trigger it, they'll say you got even more profile views, and they'll actually have you take the next step, right? An example of LinkedIn looking at long-term retention is basically them getting you to take other actions surrounding their profile, right? So the order of basically these habits that you try to build is really, really important. And so one example is, one of their triggers is basically so-and-so might have endorsed you for a certain skill, let's say marketing. To get more endorsements, you should endorse others, right? That trigger is pushed through email. The reward, if you take that action of endorsing others, is typically the reciprocation of them also giving you endorsements, and then the trigger loop starts all over again. But the point is that these loops basically build these habits over time. They build these investments over time and really get you to invest in these products and help with sort of that retention. And that's it. I actually cut it short because I didn't think I was going to have enough time, but I got more time. All right.